This is Judaism Unbound, episode 85, B Mitzvah Revolutions. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And our guest today is Aron. She is professor of Jewish education at the Ria Hirsch School of Education of Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles. She was the founding director of the Hirsch School's Experiment in Congregational Education and now is the co-director of the B Mitzvah Revolution, a joint project of the Hebrew Union College and the Union for Reform Judaism. She has published numerous articles, and she is the author or co-author of a number of books, including Sacred Strategies, Transforming Congregations from Functional to Visionary, The Self-Renewing Congregation, Organizational Strategies for Revitalizing Synagogue Life, and Becoming a Congregation of Learners, Learning as a Key to Revitalizing Congregational Life. We're excited to talk to her today about a number of topics that we've been talking about over the last few weeks, and also the whole concept of the B Mitzvah, which we've talked about a little in the past, and I'm sure we'll talk about a lot in the future, as one of the examples of a Jewish practice that is important to a lot of folks and also undergoing tremendous amount of change. So, Professor Aron, welcome to Judaism Unbound.
Thank you.
So, we thought that the place to start this conversation would be with a topic that's been coming up lately in our conversations. We've been reading more and more, and that's the distinction between elite religion and folk religion, and specifically applied to Judaism. And when I was asking around who's thinking about this stuff and written some interesting stuff on that topic, people kept saying you. So I'm wondering if, just as a place to start, could you just help our listeners understand what those terms really mean when we think about Judaism, and then we can sort of apply them. You in an article that you wrote that I read, applied it in really, really interesting ways to the Bar and Bat Mitzvah world, and I want to pursue that next. But I was hoping that you could first just sort of help us understand what that distinction is all about.
I actually want to start before Judaism. I'll start when I was a college student, when I took a seminar in anthropology, and the professor had done research on Buddhists, I think probably somewhere in Southeast Asia. And he would start by asking them about karma. And his respondents would always go into great detail about karma. It's just a thing that happens to you and you can't really change it. There's nothing you can do about it. It's your, what we say in Hebrew, your goral, your fate. And after a while, he would then say to them, "Oh, that's so interesting. Now tell me what it is you have around your neck." And of course, what they had around their neck was an amulet. And the point of the amulet was exactly the opposite of karma. The point of the amulet was to make their lives better in some way, to heal something or take care of something that was going on. And that was my first introduction to the idea of folk and elite religion. So elite religion is the religion as spoken about in the texts, as practiced by the priests or the elite of the religion. Folk religion is what the ordinary people do. So in this case, they knew that Buddhism had an important term, karma, in it, but they also wanted to practice their own kind of religion. They were not satisfied with not changing their own fate, and so they included amulets. And if you start looking at religions around the world, there are many, many examples of this, because people do their own thing with religion.
So your article that I read is responding to was written in 1985 by Stuart Schoenfeld, and it's called Folk Judaism, Elite Judaism, and the Role of the Bar Mitzvah in the Development of the Synagogue and Jewish School in America. So could you tell us about what Schoenfeld's argument is and why, I guess it was something like 25 years later, you wrote a review article of it. What was it that you had sort of discovered in that piece?
Well, I want to say that immediately as I read it, it sort of unlocked the world for me. It was not my first, as I just told you, it wasn't my first encounter of the idea of folk and elite. I actually don't know where it comes from in the general sociology of religion, but the person who brought it to Jewish sociology is Charles Liebman. He writes about it in his book, The Ambivalent American Jew. And Schoenfeld took this concept of the distinction between what the elite want and what the folk want and brought it into the world of bar and bat mitzvah. Just pretty simply, you could say that the elite are not so interested in bar and bat mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is a fairly new tradition. It's in the Middle Ages, is where it comes up first. And it comes up as kind of a marker of the mitzvot that a young man or an adolescent is supposed to observe. So it doesn't mark anything, really. It just marks an obligation. It doesn't mark a life cycle event. That comes much later. And the elite were not particularly interested in this life cycle event. The people who were really interested in it were the folk. One possible interpretation is that this event, this life cycle event, was created by caterers. In other words, here's what probably happened when Jews came to America. Here's my best guess about what happened to my father, who was born in 1916. Unfortunately, he's no longer alive, so I can't ask him. But when he belonged to a little shtibel, his family belonged to a little shtibel in Brooklyn. And when he became 13, he was called up to the Torah. That was his first official aliyah, because then that is when you become of age of mitzvot. He might have been given a talit at that point. He said a bracha. That's the first time he would have said a bracha. And probably there was a little schnapps afterwards. And that was the whole thing. And it didn't have to be any bigger because he was going to go on to lead a life of mitzvot. Possibly Jenna Weissman Joslett, she's a historian, was at Princeton, possibly at George Washington University. She writes about this, that events were created by caterers to make a bigger deal of it. As Jews got to be more middle class, this was a way of showing that they had arrived. And by the way, this is not completely unknown in other cultures. For example, the quinceañera is a great example of this. What we know before even Schoenfeld's article is that the Reform movement tried to eliminate the bar mitzvah from the Jewish celebratory, the Jewish life cycle. For logical reasons, they didn't want anybody to get the idea that you were finished with your Jewish education at the age of 13. And they substituted for bar bat mitzvah, actually it was just bar mitzvah then, they substituted for it confirmation, which was supposed to be celebrated at sometime at the end of high school or towards the end of high school. Now we get back to the folk and elite. This never took root. I think there were congregations that were able to hold off longer celebrating bar mitzvah, but eventually all Reform congregations observed b'nai mitzvah because the folk wanted it. In the 1930s, synagogue membership was diminishing, kind of like it is now, and also Jewish educators who were part of the elite and rabbis were becoming more and more concerned about the fact that people just wanted a bar mitzvah, the folk just wanted a bar mitzvah, and were dropping out of religious school and probably synagogue membership soon after that. So they got together. This is, Schoenfeld calls it a cartel. And I think this is one of the most fascinating parts about it, because it's really hard for the Jewish community to get together on anything. We don't even have to give examples. That's kind of obvious to us today. But in those days, the Jewish communities of Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, everywhere but New York, were able to get together and make a pact that they would not celebrate, they would not help congregants celebrate their b'nai mitzvah. Again, it was only boys, unless these boys had been enrolled in religious school. In those days, I'm sure they called it Hebrew school. But anyway, they all, across movements, they all managed to get together and they made a deal. We will hold by this rule that you cannot have a bar mitzvah unless you've been enrolled in religious school for a number of years before that.
That was really one of the most fascinating pieces of his article and of Schoenfeld's article, and then of how you pick up on it. That it sort of seems like when you were describing folk versus elite earlier, as the sort of the difference between, or that the folk tradition was that they Buddhists wore an amulet. That was something that they could probably obtain on their own somehow. They didn't have to go through the monks to get it, but this particular folk tradition, right, the idea that you should have a bar mitzvah, somehow it was a folk tradition, but one that was, at least in people's minds, I guess, only available through the elite institution. And that kind of
that's a really good point. Fascinating, right?
Right, and that kind of, well, it's interesting because as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about one that's very much alive in our time, which is the Western Wall, and that there's this sort of like great folk idea that to go to the Western Wall and put a note in it is something important to do. And then the Israeli government has given control over that place to a very, quote, elite, bunch of people who are making all kinds of rules and regulations that are in the way of the way that the folk would choose to do it. And, and somehow it's funny because I think that some of the members of the elite world, right, let's say Orthodox people that are not, not members of that ultra-Orthodox group that's controlling the wall are like, what's the big deal? The wall, it's not that holy. It's not that important.
Right, it's not an idol.
It's not an idol, right?
I try not to take people to the wall when I take them to Israel. It's a little hard, though.
Right, exactly. So I think like a lot of people, who are sort of, let's say the more... the more free thinkers among the elite, right, will say, what's the big deal? Just don't go to the wall, but it's actually very painful to so many people because I think there's a folk idea that the wall is so important and these elites are in the way of our ability to access it. And so what's interesting here with the synagogues, right, is that, you could imagine, right, that they would impose some kind of rule, like you got to pay us, X dollars in order to have this bar mitzvah, but they went much further than that.
They did that also.
Right, but they went much further than that, right, which is they imposed educational requirements of a number of years and all kinds of things which we know now. Today, we see that they've actually created an economic model for the synagogue where it basically is financially dependent on people who don't really attend very often. And now it's kind of like a drug. They're now addicted to that.
There is one rabbinical student, I think he was an HEC student, who wrote a blog, and he called Bar Mitzvah the crack cocaine of synagogues. And he's not wrong about that.
I'd love to flesh out a little bit more of what this term elite Judaism refers to, because I think I have an understanding of where you're going at this, but I'm imagining some of our listeners could have heard you talk about, say, Jewish educators as part of the elite. And they might be thinking, but Jewish educators now and historically haven't made much money, and they have, but I'd love to hear more.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, I'd love to. I think I understand where you're going. That the elite of Judaism, the elite of religion, are not necessarily the people we think of in society as elite. But basically,
they're
if you
not
could flesh out
necessarily
more,
the wealthy.
If you could flesh out more what this elite term refers to, that'd be great.
Okay, good. So thank you for asking, because I didn't do that before. I think that the sociological use of the term is the people who are guarding the canons of the religion. And I don't mean Orthodox, by the way. I think in Judaism, in every religion now, there a whole spectrum of belief. So it's much more complicated now in our days. But the elite in a more traditional society are the people who are guarding the truths, you could say, or the rituals of the tradition. The Buddhists who want to make sure that everybody believes in karma, okay, and who want to eliminate amulets from the society. I'm making this one up. I actually don't know that anybody tried to eliminate amulets, but I'm guessing that probably someone did. Christmas trees, by certain elites in Christianity, were considered pagan. They tried to eliminate Christmas trees. In the battle between the elites and the folk always win because there's so many more folk than elite. The classic example of this, to me, this is the most fascinating, is Kol Nidre. The prayer that begins the Yom Kippur service basically says, it's in Aramaic, so very few people really understand it or really think about what they're saying, but it basically says, all the vows I'm going to make, please God nullify them. So we're about to go into a long fast, and we've already asked to be excused from all the vows we're making. This is something that the elite of Judaism did not approve of. But somehow the folk prevailed, and today, of course, all of us think of the Kol Nidre as the opening moment of the Yom Kippur service. I don't know if there is a service that doesn't start with that. And I've heard some. I'm not a liturgical scholar, so I can't tell you exactly all the documents and response about this. But I've heard it said that it had something to do with the music. That the music was so moving and so powerful that nobody could give it up. So the elite are the people who. It's anybody who sees it as part of their responsibility to preserve the tradition in the, quote, right way.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I was going to ask about Kol Nidre. You're a mind reader. And the reason I was going to ask is because it's a particular passion of mine. It's what I wrote my undergraduate thesis about. And what I noticed there is I can point to some of the particulars. So Kol Nidre's evolution, we don't totally know exactly when it was written, or it probably wasn't written, but when it was first said, it appears to have been somewhere in the late 3 digits CE. We know it was written by like 950 or so, and the reason we know is because there are a bunch of the Gaons, who are the power structures of the Jews in that period.
The elites of their day.
Right. There's multiple of them, at least 2, who say in their works, Kol Nidre is this stupid thing. Literally, they say minhag shatut, which means a foolish custom. And that's the first mention of Kol Nidre. That's like they
Right.
It's the classic where, people say don't share the article because that's giving more publicity to the article and then it's going to help. Like literally our first record of Kol Nidre is a bunch of people saying that you shouldn't do it. And then we have that for a couple more 100 years. And then by like 1200 or so, it seems to have been normalized. And then the power structures, the elites of that time, do like it. And actually they start to take ownership and they change the language of it. They change it from past tense, all the vows that I took last year, to this year, they're null and void. And they change it to future tense for a variety of reasons that we don't have time for. And that makes it even more theologically tricky.
Right?
And it leads more elites later on to be to not be comfortable with it, including the Reform movement that totally cut it out of some of their prayer books and replaced it. It includes Mordechai Kaplan, who wanted to cut it. But as you said, that melody people seem to love. Most people don't even know what it means. If you ask them what's a neder, that's nidre,
right,
is plural of neder. Like, most people they couldn't tell you that's a Jewish vow or what kind of vow, or it doesn't matter to them. And it relates back to something Dan has said in the past about how, people are stunned when they learn that the blessing before the Torah doesn't mean now we're reading the Torah. It means, God chose us from among the people. And they think it means, oh, now it's time to read the Torah. Because like you said before, they're not learning what the Hebrew means. They're learning how to decode. It all flows together. But sorry, that was a long rant. But basically what I'm getting at is Kol Nidre. I love the way you fleshed it out because it's a perfect example of how the folk of one moment can succeed and their ideas can become the elite of another moment. And I guess on that front, I'd love to hear from you a little more about how the process of this works, because I don't think you're saying, or most scholars are saying, that it's so simple as this. There are these real boxes of folk Judaism and elite Judaism, and they exist separate from each other. It sounds like you're saying, no, they actually influence each other, and over time they can things can migrate from one to the other. So I guess I'd love to hear how that plays out in Judaism, maybe contemporarily or in history, whatever examples you might have to help our listeners with.
Well, I think the Bar Mitzvah is maybe the best example. I have to say that it's very painful to me as a Jewish educator to say that Bar Mitzvah is a great example of where the elite went off the rails. It all got distorted, right? The whole thing, that this very simple, it's actually a lovely ceremony if you think about it. It's hardly even a ceremony. This very simple moment that you come up and, so you read Torah, that's even better. But really all it requires is saying a bracha this whole thing got so distorted in so many ways. And I'm just going to tell you my mythology, sort of my mythological version of how this happened. How did it go from this tiny little thing and celebrated by schnapps to a big party? And then the elite come back and they say, oh, well, if you're going to have a party, we're going to make it have to do with Judaism. So they kind of wrestle it away from them, and we're going to make it happen by requiring to do Jewish education. And then this now is my interpretation. There's no evidence for this. So I just want to be clear that this is my story that I'm telling. My sense of what happened after that was the elite said, well, wait a second, it's really not enough to just come up. If we're going to require you to be in religious school for X number of years, it's not enough for you to just come up and say a bracha. Anybody can say a bracha. We want you to read Torah. Oh, maybe even reading Torah isn't enough. We want you to read Haftorah. And now we want you to give a little Dvar Torah. So this we know because this actually, now I have one fact that fits in this. In the I think maybe even before the 20th century, but I'd have to look this up. There were books of B'nai Mitzvah drushes that were published on the Lower East Side or somewhere in New York. So it meant that by whatever date that was, early in the 20th century for sure, there was an expectation that the 13-year-old would give a drasha, a speech. That's what drasha is, the Yiddish for the little sermonette or sermon, what we would call today a Dvar Torah. But that person that kid didn't have to make it up. They could read one out of a book that was published.
It's like those websites that people download their school paper from.
Yes, exactly. Only nobody was embarrassed about it. It wasn't like passed underneath the table. It was published. So again, my story that I would tell about this is that the unintended consequences just sucked the elites right in. Oh, we're going to make a really big deal about this service. We're going to have you read Torah. We're going to have you read Haftorah. It's no longer going to be enough for you to just give a little sermon out of a book. We're going to make you write your own. You'll have to meet with us. And then, of course, somewhere in the 1960s, I'm just guessing, you're going to have to do a mitzvah project. It's not enough. You have to learn what a mitzvah is, and you have to do something that's social justice or social action related. But what we have here is a kind of a vicious cycle. Like the more the elite ask of the folk, the more the folk resist. And it involves money because synagogue dues are so expensive, and it involves time. And the folk start rebelling against it, and you can see that pretty easily. Oh, I don't know, in the blogosphere. There's an article somewhere about some parent writing about, really, all you have, I think it was the rabbi actually writing, all you really need is 6 weeks. You just come and you pay me. You don't have to pay a synagogue dues. I can teach you everything your child needs to know in 6 weeks, and they can have a beautiful life cycle event. So now this rabbi, at least, and other rabbis too, are completely sucked into this. You want a bar mitzvah? I'll give you a bar mitzvah. I'll give it to you cheaply. I'll give it to you at a whole lot of time.
I told the story before about my son, but when my son was preparing for his bar mitzvah, I said to him, I sort of think creatively about Judaism for a living, so your bar mitzvah could be anything. Let's really talk about what it would mean to be a Jewish man and whatever. And he thought about it for a little while, and he said, I think I'd like to read from the Torah and make a speech.
And it's not his fault. He's got it from the culture. He's got it from his friends. And 13-year-old is a little young to be inventing a new ritual, right?
Right. And I have to say, like you were saying, and it was beautiful, right? And I had exactly the experience that you described, right? I was moved in a way that I rarely am at synagogue, and whatever. And so I think I guess my question is, there's two elements to this with the bar mitzvah, or with the B Mitzvah. One is the possibility of reimagining the B Mitzvah so that it would be more successful at, let's say, having long-term impact, etc. But the other, I think, is where you're going, which is that the educational work of Judaism, and I think also many other elements of the synagogue world have become unfortunately entangled with the B Mitzvah. I'm curious whether there's work going on, or there's work that you advocate to go on to sort of dislink, or is that even possible anymore, so that we can, so that synagogues are there synagogues out there that have solved this, that have not oriented their educational programming for kids to the B Mitzvah, and that are actually able to educate Jewishly much better as a result? Or if not, are there things that you're trying to advocate that would go in that direction?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that I think there are lots of synagogues, maybe not lots, maybe 100 synagogues, that this has been going on for a while. About in 1990, we started, by we I mean the School of Education at HUC in LA, we started a project called the Experiment in Congregational Education. And we didn't start with Bar Mitzvah, we actually started with adult education, but pretty soon we went around to the education of children, not in day schools, but in synagogue schools. And there have been various attempts to really improve education of non-day school children I think in the Reform and Conservative Reconstructionist movements in independent synagogues. I don't know of anything in the Orthodox world, although I think there are a few things. Those attempts have sort of tried to put the Bar Mitzvah in its place. In other words, yes, the Bar Mitzvah is it's an interesting moment in the life cycle of a child and a family, right? It's the moment at which, if you had to pinpoint a moment at which your child is about to become an obnoxious adolescent, no offense, I'm sure yours was not obnoxious, but mine were. You know, if there was a moment where your kids are going to start pushing back at you and thinking differently, that moment could be when they're 12 or 13 years old. So it's a good moment for a family to be thinking about itself and how it needs to reconfigure itself. And that's something a synagogue can help families do. And there are synagogues that are doing that. So what they've done is taken the idea of the Bar Mitzvah, put it back in the context of a full Jewish education, which includes the parents, and of course then started really great programming for post-B'nai Mitzvah that attracts the kids and keeps the kids. So I don't want to count how many synagogues there are like that, but there's a significant number.
What I've heard from people that seem to be having success in my circles with B Mitzvah kinds of rituals is partially related to what everybody talks about in terms of how millennials think, how, the next generation, Gen Z, relates to the world. And it's about sort of introducing a little bit more personalization and choice into the matter. Not in a sense that gets rid of Jewish content, but in a sense that, relating back to what we said before, it gets rid of the sense that, you have these 7 things. You're going to chant Torah, you're going to chant Haftorah, you're going to do the Mitzvah Project, you're going to do the Devar Torah, blah, 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 blah. And it's even saying all those things and listing them, it's overwhelming. And nobody, especially at age 13, even if they're doing an adult B Mitzvah, can do all of those in a deep spiritual or holy way. Right. And so when I've spoken to people, a rabbi of mine, she has tracks in her congregation, and each B Mitzvah student that she works with, she sits down with them at the beginning without their parents. Actually, this is just because from her perspective, and I think there's pluses and minuses to this approach. She wants to hear directly from the kid themselves and hear what their interests are. And she says, okay, what are you interested in? And she sort of caters things for some of them. They really do. They emphasize sort of the mitzvah part of B Mitzvah, and that mitzvah project for a year that you talked about. That's sort of the mode she goes. And they may not chant Torah. Like, they may not do that at all. They will probably, in a service situation at some point, like, mark the occasion and invite the family and all of that. But their focus is, we're going to go really hard on learning about social justice from a Jewish lens, on doing this in more than a surface level way, on thinking about what it means to choose the kinds of projects you work on or support or whatever from a justice lens, what's Jewish giving, what's general giving, what's the overlap. I mean, those are the kinds of things that even a seventh grader can actually start to think about. That's one track. There's another track that's just like the learning track, where they really emphasize learning about some element or elements of Jewish history or Jewish culture. And then the third is the classic. But she doesn't pose it as this is the normative one, and then here are your alternatives. Because when this goes back to what Dan said before about his own, some people, that's a great option to do a spiel in front of the congregation. I relish my Bar Mitzvah speech that I gave. I actually still remember it. And that, more than any of the other stuff, was really meaningful for me. So that I actually would keep that if I were to rewrite my own experience. And for some kids, I think that's awesome. But she doesn't say, oh, here's the normal one and here's two other options. She says, here are 3 tracks. What are we going to do? And those kids, from what I've seen, and I met a few of them in an education context, seem to have really rich, meaningful experiences because there's that level of personalization in there.
B'nai Jehoshua Beth Elohim, BJBE. It's in, somewhere in the suburbs of Chicago. And they now have, when they joined the B'nai Mitzvah Revolution, they decided they were going to do exactly what you describe, only they're doing it, with several hundred kids. I guess 100 a year is the number of B'nai Mitzvah they have. They created 3 tracks. One is the normative track, but now it's called My Prayer, something like that. It's the one in which you spend a lot of time in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade learning about prayer and writing your own prayers and interpreting prayers. And so when you get to that service, you actually give not necessarily a Devar Torah, but you give a Devar Tefillah. You elucidate a prayer, or you perform a prayer in some other ways through music or art or something like that. So that one's focused on prayer. The other one is called Team Tzedek, and it's the social justice track, where kids and this involves parents from the beginning. Parents spend a lot of time doing social justice work in teams in 3rd, 4th grade, and then they celebrate a bar mitzvah together. That's another thing we haven't talked about, but this synagogue wanted to get off the idea that a bar mitzvah had to be, your individual child's way to shine. And so the culmination of this is a group bar bat mitzvah ceremony, and it might be at the place where they've done their social justice work. And the third is this congregation is very Israel focused, and so the 4th and 5th grade is spent learning a lot about Israel, and the culmination is a group trip to Israel, not like the family trip to Israel, but the group trip to Israel, where the kids will be the tour guides for their families based on what they have studied. They're not going to be the complete tour guides, but they will each have parts that they present. Now I'll give you one more example, which comes from my synagogue, Temple Emmanuel in Beverly Hills. I'm sorry that this actually didn't spread, but one particular family, a family that belongs to my minyan, the father is a convert to Judaism. The mother is really not all that interested in Judaism at all. And Patrick, the father, felt that he his kid went to the day school there, but he felt that he couldn't really impose on his wife having a bar mitzvah since he never had one himself. It was interesting man. But anyway, they met with the rabbi, who was Rabbi Laura Geller, and they came out of this meeting with the idea that their son, Simon, would have to accomplish 13 tasks that represented being a Jewish adult. Okay, and some of them were Jewish and some of them were not particularly Jewish. So Simon's mother is a book editor, and so he read a book and wrote a critique of the book or a review of the book. His father is a restaurant critic, so he, cooked a meal and wrote about it or something like that. And then the one that I remember is the one that he spoke about at his actual bar mitzvah. He took a trip by bus from downtown LA to Santa Monica. So I don't know if you know LA at all, but that's, buses, I think this is starting to change now. This happened maybe 3 or 4 years ago. But public transportation is only really for poor people, or was only for poor people in Los Angeles. So the fact that as a not even yet 13-year-old, he boarded a bus at one end of town and took it to the other end of town. And his parents actually later talked about how much trepidation they had about his doing this. At his Bar Mitzvah, he talked about the people who count in LA and the people who don't count in LA and the people who don't count that he saw on this bus trip that he did. So that was quite a powerful moment and a really turning of the Bar Mitzvah into something that is, I don't think that kid will ever forget, and nobody who was there at the service ever will forget.
Do you have a sense of when given the choice, what percentage of parents choose the traditional way and what percentage choose, or kids, right? Choose the very small choose the non-traditional way. I mean, the synagogue hasn't given up, but I think their first year they had, 3 parents in each of the alternative tracks. But that doesn't surprise me, and I want to take this back to this folk elite thing, because I think it's sort of something again that I think strikes the people who are sort of have the elite education but don't like to do things the traditional way, is find very puzzling, right? Which is that it feels like part of the folk tradition of the B Mitzvah, but I think it goes far beyond that. I mean, I think about people who want to be married by a rabbi, even though strictly speaking, Judaism doesn't require that, right? That part of the folk tradition is somehow to do it in a way that the folk perceive of as the proper way.
That's exactly right. It's like Israelis who, are not religious at all, but when their son has a bar mitzvah, it's got to be in an Orthodox synagogue.
Right. And so then when someone comes and tries to say, but it doesn't have to be that way, it's not that they don't necessarily believe the person who's saying that. It's something more along the lines of, but it just wouldn't feel right. And I don't know, how that whole thing can be dislodged, or if it can, or or is the force for a new way has to come from within the folk? I mean, I'm asking specifically about the B Mitzvah, but I'm also asking broadly, how do you get sort of folk traditions to change when they're not serving the folk well on their own terms?
So I haven't given up. I've only been at this for 5 years, and in this particular iteration, I think it's very slow. I mean, we just had a conference in LA in June about reimagining the religious school, and we were so excited that 145 people came to it. I mean, we thought we would get 30. Okay, so let's acknowledge that we're talking about very small numbers. We're not talking about 300 people coming to it. We're saying that we were thrilled to have 145 people come to it. It's a slow process of people getting to see a bar mitzvah that was a little different, or getting to see what religious school looks like if it's not the kind that it was in that movie, The Serious Man. People are holding on to old images of all sorts of things. And I haven't given up. I think over time, people will change.
So I have a thought. Hopefully, it will turn into a question. We'll see. But my thought is, I'm just thinking out loud about a variety of situations where folk Judaism, I think, has worked in a really positive way. And I'm coming back to my optimism again. But I've read some things. I'm thinking back to our conversation very early in our podcast with Vanessa Oakes, who speaks about this a little bit. And also Susanna Heschel has, of course, I mean, she's famous, partially incorrectly in terms of the story of the orange on the Seder plate, but she is involved in that story. But I'm thinking of all of these rituals that we now take for granted as existing in Jewish life. Baby namings for girls. In addition to circumcision, stuff being put on the Seder plate. It's not just the orange at this point. It's that now we have a norm where even Jews that aren't that involved in Jewish life seem to know that, I can put other things on my Seder plate and describe meaning for them. You're right that it's slow going, but I think 145 people gathering to think this out, and I'm really optimistic about what that kind of event can mean for the future, because I look at so many situations. I even think about how music can spread. I think of how one melody, this is also documented in Vanessa Oakes' book, one melody can come to, one conference and end up spreading to the entire Jewish world within a decade or two. She talks about that in her book. And I guess I'm feeling that sense of optimism. Maybe we don't all see it that way, but I guess maybe beyond B Mitzvah for a second, I'm wondering if you can comment on sort of how we can bring this spirit to the Jewish world in general, how the thinking you're doing and those around you are doing about B Mitzvah can maybe apply in a bigger way to reimagined, reinvented kinds of Judaism that will speak to more people now and in the future.
That's such a good question. I think that after we had our conference, the group of us that had planned it, the 8 or so of us, retired to a coffee shop nearby, and we're talking exactly about this. And the book we kept referring to is Malcolm Gladwell's book about the tipping point. It's all about creating a tipping point. That his examples are mostly taken from the world of the media or advertising or products, but I think there's something to it that we need. So after the conference, we spent a lot of time talking about what do we need to do to enrich the ecosystem so that it becomes an expectation. Here, let's go back to Bar Mitzvah for a minute. It's an expectation that your Bar Mitzvah is more than a perfunctory thing where you're memorizing a whole lot of things. It's an expectation that the school or whatever educational thing that you send your child to is really deeply meaningful to them, and it does things in a different way, in an experiential way. People now have a sense that a service can be different, and to places like B'nai Jeshurun and to people like Amichai Lau-Lavi, people know that it's not just a regular old service that you're going to go to. You could actually have a really spiritually uplifting experience at a service. But it takes a long time, and I'm not sure what else you could do to make this spread. That's something that we're thinking a lot about.
We always like to, as we arc towards the conclusion of episodes, we always like to ask guests if there's anything that we haven't been able to talk about that feels relevant to you or that you'd like to bring to our listeners out there. Is there anything that comes to mind that we haven't been able to touch base about that you'd like to put out there for folks to think?
I think so. This is also a new thought for me, and I'm not sure how far I would take it, but I'm going to throw it out there. I was very struck by the idea that you were interpreting, at least at the beginning, a lead as someone who was wealthy or great standing in a community. And I would like to throw out there that in this world today, in the 21st century, anybody can be an elite. Anyone can have an idea, become informed, and really make changes. So this should no longer be the kind of thing that we are waiting for the rabbis to do.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a really great conversation, and you've gotten us thinking in ways that will be helpful for us moving forward.
Thanks. It's been really fun talking to you, and thank you for your interest in my work.
Absolutely. And we want to close out the episode by shouting out to all of you out there listening, because we love it when you are in touch with us. And there are a few ways for you to do so. The first way that you can do so is by heading to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. You can also check out our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@nextjewishfuture.org or lex@nextjewishfuture.org. And the last plug we like to make is that you can always support us financially with either a one-time gift or a monthly recurring donation. And you can do that at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.